important. Okay, we are recording. The transition from normal life to this stuff is really interesting. I mean, it's super interesting because one of the arguments that I'm making, when I remember to make it, is that this thinking and reading and meditating should, in the best of all possible worlds, make a difference in our lives. And I should be the main, one of the main advertisers of that. And sometimes I feel like it, but this morning I didn't, and so I gave some thought to we will get to the substance of the text, I promise. But I gave some thought. I didn't get too far with it, so I'm going to throw it back to you people to ruin your week. Actually, I did get some mileage out of it because there's a difference, as Jung was fond of pointing out, between the collective unconscious, which was a term he gave up, and the individual unconscious, and between the wider world, conscious and otherwise, and each of our little worlds, conscious and otherwise. So there is a feeling of transition when you start reading about these foreign cosmologies. Okay, so I'll try to say this quickly. So if you're interested in modern cosmology and you open up a popular book on contemporary cosmology, it won't be like this stuff. And I'm thinking of physics and astronomy and even biology and the evolution of life on Earth and all that. Any of the contemporary scientific cosmologies that are usually given that name, you won't see the category of the person in there. That happens, a lot later, and it isn't important for the natural sciences. But in this cosmology, or I should properly say these cosmologies, because he covers a lot of ground, Corbin does, the person is, as he says in another essay, the first and final fact, and he really means that. And so the category of personhood, however defined, is literally central to these cosmologies. And therefore, you sit down to begin reading this material, and within a page or two, you discover that time is a person, and that there are persons everywhere. And we talked about that some last time. But the point that I want to start with, well, wait a minute. This should have some immediate relevance to my life. And what do I even want to say here? I started with this because when the idea occurred to me earlier, I thought, yeah, I can say that in class. What was I thinking? Oh, here's yeah, I'm sorry. It takes me a while to get started. So one way into this, and I've got pictures for us this time. One way into this is the idea of light, and we'll talk about the iconography of light a little bit later on. And I guess that's in my experience, that's the easy way for me, for whatever reason. Metaphors of, and I suppose this has very broad relevance, but metaphors of light and space and time, they do tend to work on your brain and heart. And if you're taking them seriously, as we do in reading this material, they do make you feel better, or they can. Or they can make you feel worse because they don't make you feel better. You know, you think, oh God, this is such beautiful stuff, and I'm in such a mess right now that it makes me feel worse to read Corbin and know how glorious my life should be. Well, so I got thinking about that this morning. Because no one's life is celestial, very often actually, and so one of the things that it occurred to me in a way that I guess in the end I can't articulate. I thought, well, you know, okay, Henri, and all you Zoroastrians and Ismailians, make this work for me right now. And the best I've got all my other ways in, beauty and art and light and great literature, but I needed something that would puncture the, yeah, this is it, that would puncture the totality of my solipsism and narcissism and relativize it. That's way too academic. Puncture its, yeah, that's why the balloon image came to me. Puncture the inflation. Yes, that's what I'm trying to get at. To puncture the inflation that I, at least, carry around with me all the time. My sufferings are the world's. No, I don't actually mean that because I don't think that. But you know how totalizing your miseries can be. They just take over your world. And they could be little miseries. You might have a hangnail. I mean, they could be little miseries. They could be big miseries, but they just take over your whole world. And I guess what I'm saying is that for a brief moment, not only did the light metaphors work, but for me, in the moment, you know, to make this material, to bring this material to the level of the imagination of the heart. But for a brief moment, things just cleared for me in the movement from my person to the person of the angel. And this ball of conundrums is part of the reason that I find Corbin so interesting to contrast with either Hillman or Jung, and for me it's usually Hillman because I feel closer to his work, because Hillman was a psychologist. And, you know, so he spent his days thinking about all these little individual personal weirdnesses, and and Corbin doesn't do that because that wasn't his job, you know. And therefore in Corbin I sometimes feel the lack of that connection to what Hillman calls it, the pain and suffering that we're involved in right here, and yet, and now I'm off on a limb somewhere, and I wish I could recapture the moment of clarity that occasionally happens in Corbin's work, at least for me, which has the effect, and let me just say it again to get it in my own head, of puncturing your inflations and puncturing your self-centeredness. That's one of the chief thrills. Yeah, that's one of the chief thrills of encountering an alien cosmology. And because it's thrilling, and, it's thrilling. It might be a little thrill, but still, it's thrilling and enlivening and opening, and you feel a sense of possibility. And because that's an embodied feeling, if you are the right kind of person, or if you're trying to be the right kind of person, and that's where I stand, what you then, I think, want to be able to do is to hang on to that thrill. And I hate to put it this way, but put it to work. Like if you're outside and you're miserable and you start thinking about alien cosmologies because class is at 4:00, and you suddenly think, oh, wow, the category of a person is so much. It's just infinitely bigger than this silly little sad bag of shit I live in. And that you ought to be able, what they are inviting us to is, you don't have to do that. Hillman and Jung and many, many, many other people will then give you some tools for that. And Corbin maybe, he's not as good as he could be, but he's so, in giving you particular tools such as a therapist would, and yet, he kind of does, because if you read him the way we're trying to read him, it's super passionate, and it's super curious. I didn't assign this entire essay because I still find it kind of exhausting. And it's one of the pieces that I got to reading seriously quite late in my reading of Corbin, because every time I tried to get in there, I thought, well, this is really hard. I don't know what he's talking about. And how do I want to do this? So that is not at all the way I thought I was going to start this. And I didn't, I'll have to say, I didn't quite capture the efficacy that I felt a few hours ago in reading this and trying to get out of my inflated bubble of, admittedly, we live in a rural area, but I don't think that matters at all. Each one of us, no, let's do the gendered thing and the many of us find it remarkably easy to live inside our own fantasies. That's what I'm trying to get at. as if they were, and to live them as totalizing discourses. And one of the things that Corbin's work reminded me of, it, and I didn't get it entirely from him, of course not, but one of the things it reminded me of this morning was that moment of stepping back and trying to see things from a different point of view. That, I guess, in a way, I guess that's all I'm trying to say, but there's more, and I'm sorry, but I'm having a little trouble teasing it out. So look, what we're doing in these first pages is kind of startling, and this fits perfectly with the material, with the stuff we talked about last week, which was about, the loosening of your sensorium. Remember that the ancient Greeks lived in a different world from us, and obviously the ancient Zoroastrians did too, and all that. So we're trying to loosen up our conceptions to begin with of what constitutes our sensorium. So that's that's a huge part of this. Boy, I feel as if I'm going to come around to being semi-articulate any minute now. So just be patient. I mean, look what he is doing here. Time, space, the person, matter, those are all being upended, inverted, turned around, seriously messed with in these first pages. I'm used to it now, and I think you all are too, but I certainly wasn't when I first read this book, when I was first trying to get into Corbin's. And because it happens all at once, because yeah, so much for the clarity. He's sketching an entire I'm sorry to keep using the word, but cosmology, which is radically different from the one we were, almost all of us, I would gather, were taught to assume is true. So linear time doesn't disappear, but it gets subsumed under other kinds of time. We discover that space is really mutable, because we're going to talk about musical spaces and temporal spaces right at the beginning. He starts messing around with time and space in ways that are confusing, and then at the same time we discover that persons are everywhere, and I couldn't find the quote, and maybe I made it up. We are engaged in a discourse where thought occurs via the images of persons. It's not just that we are thinking in images, which is hard enough, but something that we do when you bring your knowledge of Jung or Hillman or art or whatever. We do think in images, but Corbin is standing outside that whole tradition, and that's the trick, remember. He's standing outside that whole tradition and saying, actually, no, the primary fact is persons. I mean, originally God, the supreme being, but all the creations, and we're here at the level of time and different kinds of time, and all the angels, and they're all persons, and so the suggestion is that in order to think at this cosmogonic, gonos from Genesis, we're engaged in making a cosmology here, that the primary thing is a person, and it remains undefined, which is, well, so do time and space and matter for that matter, but kind of annoyingly, the person is something you'd kind of want a definition for. I mean, we all have ideas of what matter and space and time kind of are, and we live fairly happily without defining them. But the person, nobody knows what a person is. I mean, we could all talk about it for a little while, but I would venture to say that all of us would say, yeah, I'm not quite sure what a person actually is. And so Corbin's just saying, well, that's fine. We're going to take that as our primary datum, is the person is the first and final fact. And footnote, so this is a great example of that movement in the 20th century of trying to get outside of Western thought, Western metaphysics, and all the little constraints that come with that. And that's one of the things that makes it very hard. It's also very hard because he knows a lot, and he's putting a lot in a very small space. There's foreshadowings here of themes that just recur in his work. This was written, or at least it was delivered at Aranos in 51. Either 51 or 52. And he was first there as a speaker in 49. So this is one of his early forays. And he's only, he's in his late 40s at the time, because he was born in 03. And so this is the work of a pretty mature scholar and thinker. He's not just a kid. He's been chewing on this material for a really long time. And he's what do I want to say? As I was reading it this time, I just had this sense of, and you can confirm or deny it in your own reading, of the enthusiasm in here. So just as an example, I've got my, whoops, you can't see it. There it is. You see what happens? Isn't that cool? But I've got my hard copy of Cyclical Time here, and I was marking up a digital edition. So I went through, a number of pages, and I made all these exciting marks. And then I compared it with the ones on the same pages in my original copy, and they were all different. Over the years, this one's been marked up in various ways, but by God, every time you go through it, it's a little bit different. And I, as I was looking at the markings on one, and then how could I not have marked that? I just had the overwhelming sense of enthusiastic scholarship, and of the really dense tangle of allusions and references that have gone into this piece. Anyway, So there's that. Oh, as a footnote to that footnote, gosh, yeah, let me do this. So in recent readings, I ran across a book. I was interested, and still am, I suppose, in Taoism. And so I was looking at a book by David Hinton, which is called China Root, and it's about the Chinese roots of Zen Buddhism. And I think it's quite good. But one of the things that struck me, this is, again, it's kind of a meta comment. In one of his early chapters, Hinton is trying to explain what the Tao is. And as you could guess, you don't have to know anything to guess this, that's going to be a bit of a trick, you know? But one of the things that he says while he's trying to explain what the Tao meant really struck me as similar in structure and spirit to what Corbin's doing here. So he's, and so I'm going to read this. You don't have to understand it. You just get the drift. So the Tao is composed, the yin-yang sign thing, So the Tao has both absence and presence. So in Hinton's book, he's already introduced the idea of absence and the idea of presence. And we'll see that in Corbin in terms of apophatic and cataphatic theologies. So that's the similar term in the traditions that Corbin's working in. So Hinton says, absence is not some kind of metaphysical dimension, as if that were a bad thing. That's what he's trying to say here. It is instead simply the empirical cosmos seen as a single generative tissue. Okay, so one of the things so absence is not some abstract metaphysical thing. It's the empirical cosmos seen as a single generative tissue. That's that movement of, this is overstating, but I'm still searching to translate the feeling that I had a few hours ago. That's that same movement of deflation of the inflated ego. Suddenly you think, what? Everything I've thought about reality is being challenged. Absence is simply the empirical cosmos seen as a single generative tissue. And we're not going to spend an hour trying to tease that apart, but I guess what I'm pointing to is, oh my God, that undoes everything. If you were raised as I was, to assume scientific realities and all that, and if you grow up in the culture that I grew up in, and now I'm being told. So that's what Corbin and Hinton are both doing here. They're saying, hey, hey, chill out, just calm down. Let's do some philosophy, or if that's a word you don't like, let's do some religion, or if you don't like that, let's think, or no, let's just be, or let's do hima, which is a word we will learn in a couple weeks, which is the Arabic for what Corbin translates as the thought of the heart. So these guys are not messing around. They've come to 2,000 years of Western history, and they've just said, screw that. This is not going well. And what do you do instead? You do the thought of the heart. And what does that look like when you just sit the hell down and do it? It looks something like what Corbin's doing, and he's got all the bells and whistles, and Hinton is a poet and a scholar of Zen Buddhism, so he's way more stripped down. But they're both in their own ways saying, oh, shut up and listen. Now they each have the traditions that are going to shape the kind of listening that they suggest that we do. But the explosion that results from these moments of quiet listening is because the world just explodes at you if you let it. I mean, that's not quite right. So that's absence. Seeing the world as a single generative tissue, okay? Woo, boy, talk about flow, all right? While presence, and here comes, another Corbin part. Presence is the cosmos seen as that tissue, that generative tissue, individuated into the 10,000 things. I mean, so I don't know, right in a moment here, I mean, that is so cool. And I guess what I'm remembering is why I ended up in philosophy in the first place. And I guess I'll, in 15 seconds. So I didn't know what I was going to take as an undergraduate, but my mother said she thought I might like philosophy, and I sure didn't want to take any intro courses. And intro to anything. I'd had enough high school shit. I didn't want any of that. And the only curriculum that didn't have an intro as a requirement, in order to be a philosophy major, you didn't have to take intro to philosophy, thank God. You could just start with ancient Greece. You could just start. And I can remember to this day Lester Rees standing up and starting with Parmenides. And I thought, so we were talking being and time and non-being, and to a large proportion of the human population, that's just utter nonsense, abstract bullshit. But for whatever reason, and it must have been something in how Lester was doing this, it was like, this is the real stuff. And what point? The point is that people don't do this enough. In the following sense. It's rare to lie down in the grass looking up at the blue sky with someone and saying, what do you think it all means? What is time? What is space? What are persons? Not that doesn't happen, because of course it does. But most of the time, for extremely good reasons, we're running on autopilot, and we're using, and the emphasis on using ideas and habits and forms of behavior that have been totally ingrained on us by society most of the time, because if we didn't, it would not go well. You just need that. But one of the great glories of this turn away from Western thinking, which occurred in the 20th century and continues, is that it gives each individual person can give each individual person the authority of a Socrates or a Kant or a Hegel. By means of, in Corbin's argument, I think the same would apply to Hinton for what it's worth, giving direct access to the poetic basis of mind. Well, that's what Hillman called it. And Corbin and Hinton, they're both pointing at that same pan-human urge to imagine the world into existence. I mean, Corbin takes that quite seriously. And when you do that, this is not what I wanted to do at all, but this is what's happening. When you do that, and you go back as far as these cosmologists are doing, everything's all mashed up together. So of course you get space and time and the person and matter and good and bad, and everything in the entire universe is all right there, because you're kind of at the moment of the Big Bang, at least intellectually and spiritually you are, because you're creating a universe. And even if the myth isn't of a Big Bang, which it isn't here in Corbin's world, still you have to, as Corbin says in a very late essay, you somehow have to make everything come from nothing. And therefore everything was all together at one place, and now you've got to kind of lay them out. So the thing about Corbin's idea of the person, which is so strikingly radical here, at least to a white male middle class American, is what he does with the idea of individuality. Oh, and we're way ahead of ourselves, but let me introduce that here. And there was one of you sent a question, for which many thanks, which I will read, because it's quite short and it's got, I think, 3 parts, and it's something we should all be thinking about. Question was, first of all, he said, I think it's too early for this, and I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, it's not too early because we just made the entire cosmos. So nothing's too early. I was curious about Corbin's understanding of the self, regarding its boundaries, its relationships, and the notion of the embodied self as a means towards theophany. So there's 3 things that it's important for all of us to keep an eye on as we're trying to figure out what Corbin's world is like. So we've got this category of the person, which is somehow related to the category of the individual self. Okay, so there's that, and we need to have some idea about that. What are the boundaries of the self? And let's just stay with nothing fancy, just myself, yourself, your daughter's self, whoever, some self that you're familiar with. What are its boundaries? Oh, well, and let's go on. What's it like in relationship with other selves for Corbin? And what about the idea of embodiment? Now, I think that's a great question because it's got everything in it. I shouldn't try this, but let's see what we get out of this mashup. We've just made angels so far. We haven't even talked about Varghese or the people on Earth. But you've read it and you're kind of familiar with it. So so the boundaries of the self. Well, first of all, my reading of this morning was the same as ever. You open this book, and what were my there was such cool stuff. Another self which keeps eternally ahead. It was time. Time was the thing that really got me, but time was a person. It's like on page 2 or something. Time is a person. Time is a person, and time is not linear. Time is a person. What are you doing with that? Time is a person. There's some personhood. There's characteristics of personhood in time. And time is not what we think it is, because this linear time that we're familiar with in the West, that's a pale reflection. That's what he calls later in this essay retarded eternity, which is one of the great phrases in all of Corbin. And so time is a person. I don't even know what to do about that, except here's David Hinton, next sentence about the Tao. And my associations here, we're talking about really relatively early cosmologies in two widely separated groups of humans. One is the Zoroastrians of a long time ago in what is now Iran, more or less. And the other is the Chinese, long time ago in what is now still China. And both of them have funny ideas about time. Here's what Hinton says. In its primal generative nature, this cosmology assumes a more elemental experience of time. This applies to Corbin's Zoroastrians. Not linear, the familiar metaphysical river flowing past. And here's a cool thing that I think is important. Hinton says about the ancient Taoists, it's not linear time, nor is it cyclical, as time in primal cultures is imprecisely described. My antennae shot up when I read that first a couple of years ago, because I still struggle, and I am struggling now with the idea that, Corbin talks about cyclical time very explicitly, but I've always had the feeling that that's not right. And I think that he knows that, because somewhere here on one of these early pages where he's talking about sonorous space, he's quite explicit, and he says, at the level we're working, this whole breaking things up into time and space and trying to describe them doesn't work very well, because we're limited by our own, Kantian frameworks, if you want to put it that way. So it's always been an assumption of mine that, though it's certainly not linear, this eternally active person who is eternal time is not well described as being cyclical either. I really like that, because it really leaves you hanging. Because the first step is to recognize the metaphysical possibility that linear time is a poor image of what's actually true. And then the next step would be to hang on to cyclical time and say, well, at least I kind of understand that because of the seasons and everything. But of course, a real, circle is just a line that's eating its tail. It's still linear in some sense. And what Corbin's talking about is neither linear nor cyclical precisely. It's much more, as Hinton uses the word, elemental. And that brings in matter and the elements. And I think, and I've thought for a long time and was happy to see Hinton saying this, that any of our Western attempts to understand these primal cosmologies by repurposing our categories is misleading at best, and I really like that feeling of letting go of the cycles and say and giving yourself the bodily freedom. You see, here's where the words we need new. See, doing philosophy, which is, that's what we call it, or theology, or cosmology at this level, or mythology, or if you prefer, poetry. All of these things are obviously not occurring in your heads alone. And so the intuition is that Corbin, the imaginer, what did Hillman call him? The master of the visionary recital, and David Hinton, the poet and translator, they're both insisting that properly philosophical, for the lack of a better words, thought is always embodied. Even Plato, it's in the Phaedrus, I think, where he says, this writing things down is going to be trouble. He says, writing things down, boy, I don't know. We're much better off just drinking wine and hanging around and doing this symposium, because once we start writing things down, people are going to think that it's true, when what's really going on in a symposium, or to shift contexts really in a jarring way, in a Catholic Mass, those activities of intellection are liturgical. and of course Plato didn't have the category of liturgy, or at least whatever the Greek that would maybe correspond to that might have been. I don't know, and if someone does, I'd love to know it. Because in the beginning, and if you know Pierre Hadot, the French philosopher who did so much to sort of resuscitate the pre-Socratics and point out that they weren't Harvard and Princeton philosophy professors, that they were guys who did farming, and of course they were guys, but nonetheless they were passionate livers. They were living passionately, and this is before the distinction between the academy, where people go to think, and the farm, the field, where people go to, I don't know, eat, I guess. And the same goes for our Zoroastrians and our Taoists. And so the point is that properly grounded philosophical / theological / poetic thought is, if it doesn't thrill you and make you suck your breath in, then something's gone amiss. And that's why I stayed with Lester Rees and, ended up, doing Hegel and Kant and all that other crazy stuff. And what happens is you lose contact. What can happen is you lose contact. You get 2,000 years of what people have thought, and you climb very happily right into those little boxes, whether it's psychology or economics or biology or theology or whatever. You climb into the little boxes that were made very carefully over 2,000 years of Western history, and then you live in them. And the excitement of coming out is recaptured in all of Corbin's work, I have to say, because he's constantly pushing back against a certain kind of philosophical and religious thought which has dominated in the West for centuries, So he's constantly pushing against that, and he gets tired and he gets cranky. But in his best moments, he's showing all of us that the alternative to what we have been doing is fantastic, or at least the one that he found is potentially quite fantastic. That is not at all what I thought was going to go on here, which is also fine. So Hinton, to finish my footnote, so time is this is the Hinton on the Taoist, saying time isn't linear, just as space is all screwed up and not space, nor is it cyclical. That's an imprecise description. It is instead, and here's here's time described in a way that I think helps evoke the potential personhood of it. Hinton says of the early Taoists, time is experienced as an all-encompassing generative present that might be described as an origin, moment / place, a constant burgeoning forth in which the 10,000 things emerge from the generative source tissue of existence. With suitable rewriting, that could be inserted into almost any paragraph on these first few pages of Cyclical Time, because we're in that same place, where you're creating everything, right? Absence burgeoning forth into presence. And as we will see in many different ways, inhabiting this origin, moment, place is the abiding essence of Zen practice. And that applies to, and I can't put my finger on it, but towards the end of this section in Corbin's essay, he talks about liturgy in this way. And for Corbin, as a Western Christian, the idea of liturgy is in the first instance quite specific. It had to do with the Catholic Mass and the transubstantiation of wine and bread into the flesh and blood of Christ. So, for most people, by which I mean me, that's how that example of the liturgy, since it was so absent in my experience, stood for all liturgy in my imagining, until I spent enough time with Corbin to realize, Oh, that's another thing he's blowing up here. He's simply pointing out something that any religious studies scholar would know, is that religions all have liturgies. And what that really is some form of bodily movement in sacred context. And a lot of other stuff goes on, but it's an embodied thing. It's an embodied activity. What makes it liturgical is its context, its aura, its mode of being, as Corbin would say, and therefore all sorts of things could be liturgical. And in that context, Zen practice, though they don't, maybe they do, Zen practice, that would be liturgy. So here we are in my garden in the morning, being depressed about all my psychic catastrophes, and Corbin reminds me that this origin, moment, place that I'm talking about, in Corbin's terms, that I'm invoking when we talk about Ahriman and Ormazd and all these other things, what I'm evoking there is this liturgical there's no word for it, because as soon as you put a word on it, it divides it up. It's just being. It's just the primal being. It's just the primal being human, and paying the kinds of primal attention that one can potentially pay if enough of the blocks have been removed. All right? So that I don't think it would be too much. Yeah, certainly it's what the Zen people would say, and I think it's okay. It would be okay with Corbin. You try to in your, what he refers to in a later book, which we'll read parts of, as in your own private liturgy, done properly. It's just being alive. Before all hell breaks loose, religion and spirituality is coterminous with your life. There's a footnote. There's a book by Paul Shepard called How Animals Made Us Human, which came out in the 80s, I think, and we read it once years ago for one of my ecology classes, and I've never forgotten. There's a sentence in that book where he says, we don't know what animals experience. We don't know what the lives of animals are. He says, and in a moment that's rather like Blake's invocation of the birds, flying their airy ways, and we don't know, because we're limited by our five senses. We have no idea what the birds are experiencing. Paul Shepard says, we don't know, but imagine a lion chasing a gazelle. I forget exactly how he phrases it, so I'll just do it myself. What if, in its last moments, the gazelle looks at that lion, they lock eyes, and the gazelle gives itself up in ecstasy? I never forgot that. And yeah, I can do the little crank about how it's, anthropomorphizing, and, I can do all that. But I've never forgotten that, because, of course, it's true. How do we know that the gazelle isn't expiring in ecstasy? And the point is, if something like that were to be true, then it would be true that all those animals are living liturgically. And if the lion suddenly became conscious with the consciousness of a human and wandered into a Catholic cathedral on a Sunday and observed the Mass and observed a perfect congregation, all inhabiting the mundus imaginalis, and all therefore really experiencing that liturgical moment of transformation, the lion might say, yeah, this is good, but they should come out to the Serengeti, and that's where it really happens. They just say, boy, being human, you guys have really stripped away most of the fun. And we're not, well, that's one of those ideas that you just aren't allowed to have. We don't, you see, there's a good example. There's an idea we don't get to have, except if we're poets, and then nobody reads us and nobody cares anyway. So it's with that sense of the poetic basis of mind and heart that this essay by Corbin really lights up. And speaking of light, where are we in? Okay, good. Hey, I tell you what, I'll give everybody, let me see hands. How many people want a 5-minute break? Okay, we won't do it. All right. The only reason it occurred to me is I glanced at the clock to see what I had left, and it's about halftime. Okay, here's a transition I didn't see coming. So David Hinton then says, presences burgeoning forth in the spring, the fullness of its flourishing in summer, dying back in autumn. And it is visible, that is, presences burgeoning forth, is visible as the deep subject matter of Chinese landscape paintings. Well, now we'll go back to Corbin, because if I do get to the visuals today, we'll talk about Corbin and idols and icons. But we can, if I don't get to it today, it'll come up eventually. For those of you who know a bunch of Corbin, towards the end of the Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, there's a chapter and some paragraphs about Goethe and the Farbenlehre, Goethe's color theory, and there's some paragraphs on Persian miniatures and Massignon, and it's all very wonderful and fascinating, and because Corbin saw, as did Massignon, in Persian miniatures and in icons in the Christian church, the ancient ones pre-Giotto, and then the modern ones, the tradition continued in the Eastern Orthodox Church. They saw in those forms of art an attempt to represent the primordial light of creation, and therefore those forms of art have a special place in Corbin's iconography. All right. Footnote. Around the time of Giotto in the West, and with Giotto, you get the beginnings of chiaroscuro and modeling, and that I think Corbin and others would have, and others of the iconographical of people who are enthusiastic about icons can point to that and say, it was the beginning of the end for the iconic tradition in Western art, because once you start doing the modeling of features rather than presenting them in an abstract space such as you find in early icons and in Persian miniatures, you start to get the glimmerings of modern realism. And from a certain, how you want to say this, from the point of view of the tradition of praying with icons, that transition to representational depiction is a mistake. Okay, and we can't go there because it would take too long. The reason it is a mistake is because, and let's do it from something like a Corbinian perspective, what you want to be focusing on is not the flesh and blood of the Madonna and Child, but their light, their halos, which were always there, in early Christian. No, they weren't always there, but they were often there. And then they became always there in certain religious traditions in the Christian world. And this brings us back to this difficult discussion of the Menoch and the Getic. I swear to you that everything in Corbin is on like 8 pages in this essay. You can find almost everything stuck in there somewhere. So here's a huge theme in Corbin and in human life. So, so where let's take stock. I don't even know what page that is because this thing doesn't have pages. We're on page 5 or 6. It's early. It's early in this essay, and he hasn't established anything. He hasn't argued for anything. This is just the presentation of some mythologies. And if it were somebody else beside Corbin, it'd be a list, and you'd just go through them, and then he'd tabulate a table, and he'd do some data, and he'd throw some dates around, and then he'd have a conclusion, and then he'd get his PhD. But it's Henri Corbin, and so it's never quite clear what he's doing. He's clearly taking this material extremely seriously. And we won't get to this part of it, but what he's doing in the essay as a whole, and we didn't even assign the whole thing, is he's showing some Zoroastrian precursors to some later Islamic developments, and remember that he got this orientation, I think, more or less, from Shuravardi, who saw himself as being the unifier of Iranian Persian religious traditions. Shuravardi is a Muslim, and God says to every people, I have given a prophet. So he looks to his predecessors, the Zoroastrians, and he says, well, they had a prophet, and he came from God, and so there must be lots of similarities between Zoroastrianism and Islam, and so I'm going to show you what they are. And Corbin's very much doing that kind of thing here. So the first part of this essay is the Mazdean, and by the way, it took me forever to really get clear in my head that Zoroastrianism and Mazdeanism are the same for Corbin, because it's Ahura Mazda. That's the great Lord. And so Mazdeanism and Zoroastrianism are the same. And of course, annoyingly, there are all sorts of branches of Zoroastrianism. But what Corbin is trying to do is to carry some of these themes through into later Persian religion. But we're mostly interested in just pulling this Zoroastrian story, these Zoroastrian stories, into the present, because it's by revalorizing them, as he would say, it's by reading these myths and bringing them into the present through your own hima, your own creative imagination, that makes them precisely not past, but present. And that's part of the whole argument about why linear time is a problem, and why it's also why he pissed off all his historically minded contemporary scholars, because he would just do these things. But from his point of view, the only, you can't say ideas, you can't say religions. Well, no, you just have to say the only realities are always personal. And where is the person? For both the Taoists and for Corbin, it's now. In this moment, everything. Because all you ever have is this moment. If you were raised in a culture where linear time is the presumed, assumed bedrock nature of time, then that feels funny. That means you're just forever skidding along on this little line. And why would you want to focus on the present? Because it's just like going by too fast. It's like that archetypal story of the Australian Aboriginal elder riding in a jeep across the countryside, and he was trying to sing and say his songs because you had to say them as you walked through the landscape, and they were going 40 miles an hour, and he couldn't keep up. That's the problem here. So if you were raised with the idea of linear time, then being present in the moment is like this flitting thing, which you kind of, all right, everybody says you're supposed to do that. And Corbin's saying, no. And so are the Zen masters. And no. That's not what's going on here, because that's not what time is. In the extreme, time is a person. Wait a minute. Let me pull it back again. Time is an all-encompassing generative present, a constant burgeoning forth in which the 10,000 things emerge from the source tissue of existence. I can't lay my hand on it, but that's what Corbin calls the pleroma, the fullness of reality. It's a good word from medieval theology. So that in Corbin's, it occurred to me that there's kind of a homology between, and put this in an addendum. Don't blame me with this, but there's kind of a homology between what Corbin means by the pleroma and the contemporary cosmology of the Big Bang. And there's a phrase somewhere in this essay that brought this to mind, and now I'm not going to be able to find it. But he's, I know, I do know. Yes, it's right here, right in the Minak and Gedik. So, yeah, sorry. If I were actually going to write this down, this would all be beautiful. But here it is. It's on the page I was going to read. So let's put a pin in this, as Ezra Klein likes to say. the material world is fantastic. Okay? It's infinite and wonderful and full of light. We will continue enthusing about the material world in just a second. But remember the backdrop for this, for Corbin, and for many people raised in certain kinds of religious traditions. And for Corbin, it was, Catholicism and oh God, like Calvinism. Oh man, like certain kinds of Protestantism, in which the material world is fallen. It falls. You had Paradox. Oh, this is super important for Corbin, and this is what I wanted to get to. So we're finally getting to it. Because it struck me reading these pages this time that although I've talked about this and written about it a number of times, it just seemed super strong to me here. Corbin's enthusiasm for matter and the sensuous, and it could be traced perhaps to this Zoroastrian origin, and I've put it there a few times. On the other hand, and I did want to say this out loud to you folks so that you could be aware of it, in my own work, I've always been conflicted, and I don't think I can any longer tell whether it's a conflict in Corbin or just a conflict in me. And of course, it could be both of us. It could be a conflict in Corbin as well as a conflict in me. I've tried to argue that it wasn't a conflict in Corbin, and the conflict is between the spiritual and the embodied, the fleshy and the spiritual. And so the background for Corbin's enthusiasm for materiality and substance is the rejection of the fallen world by many forms of Christianity. You want to get out of here. This is a fallen world, and you want to go back to heaven because it's in heaven where all the cool stuff is. Now, this gets a little confusing, but many people have argued weakly and strongly and everything in between that much of the history of Western civilization is tied somehow to this particular quasi-Christian distinction between the perfection of heaven and the fallen evil nature of the material world. So that's the background for Corbin's enthusiastic embrace of this Zoroastrian perspective. Sadly, for my purposes, that is confused by the fact that certain of the Zoroastrians were serious dualists, others not quite so serious dualists. This is that whole maddening discussion of the pure Zervanism and the Zervanized Mazdianism and the Mazdianized Zervanism and all that. So many, this is a footnote to that footnote, many people are aware of the Zoroastrian dualism between light and dark. Corbin is pointing out that does not, for the Zoroastrians, map on to the distinction between heaven and earth. Quite the contrary. And reading this through this time with particular lenses that I had, I just really got that with both barrels from him. In a way that I hadn't before, but that's me reading this for the umpteenth time. and maybe it's just because I really want him to be doing this. But we talked about it in the beauty course on Thursday. Corbin says in one of the untranslated volumes, he says that in the West we have over the centuries had a kind of disjunct idea between the Christian idea of heaven and the Greek ideal of beauty, so that the disembodied spiritualized heaven of certain Christians has become totally disjointed from the Greek idea of embodied, fleshy, paganized beauty. And Corbin says that's wrong. But if you want to know why it's wrong, it seems to me that this essay is one of the better places to look. So, so keeping in mind that light is a metaphor, but also literal, I really want to get this into my own head squarely. So here we are on page whatever it is, 5, 6, 7, and we've realized that three-dimensional space isn't going to help us because, there's so much in here. Better still, he says, the terms elevation or height and depth suggest the dimensions of visual space. This is on page 2 of this. And the exigencies of language compel the myth to place the power of light and the power of darkness in this sort of spatial relation. So we say higher and lower. And then, in a footnote, or better still, he says, since this light has been announced to us as, and this is the first we hear of it, vibrating eternally with the voice of Ormazd, we might evoke the idea of a sonorous space, a sound space, a being, it's not just a space. You see, it's almost impossible to think along with him because, wait, a space isn't a being. But no, this space is a being. In fact, it's a person. Okay? So, he's just, in order to read this, you got to scramble you got to realize that, no, he's not meaning these things. So vibrating eternally with the voice of Ormazd, we might evoke the idea of a sonorous space, which is a being in whom, a personal being, the archetypal dimension that shines through resembles a musical motif, which also utters the promise of its metamorphosis. So the unsuspecting modern Westerner, me, comes to this, seeing the words time, space, person, and matter. And by page 2, you're already totally befuddled. I'm going to back up again before we take another run at the Menic and the Getic. Another metaphor in Corbin's work that you have to pay attention to is the metaphor of music. And if I haven't said that yet, I should have already said it 8 or 10 times, because though it doesn't appear everywhere, when it does appear, it's super important. I did mention that he was a keyboardist and played the organ and keyboards and whatnot. And musical analogies are crucially important for him. And that, I mean, it makes sense, because I think most of us can recognize that music establishes a space, but not a literal three-dimensional space, although it does that too. And that's important, you know. So all of these categories are, what's a good word? They do what modern Western male scientist types say they do, but they do so much more. Okay, so space, there are three-dimensional spaces in which beings exist, for sure. But the person who creates those also does lots of other shit. You know, that's just like one little thing. Oh, yeah. I'll give them, in their retarded eternity, I'll give them a little space, you know, three-dimensional space to muck around in. But that's just so that they can kind of smell their way to the real stuff, you know? This is part of my attempt to turn this, to invert, yes, the intuition is that this discussion in these first few pages has the effect of inverting the Christian story of the fall. Ha! That may or may not be true, but it's the intuition that I had. So the story is, everything is in heaven is just wonderful, and we all want to go back there because the Garden of Eden and all that. And down here, we're contaminated with confusion and shit, and we've got evil. We've got Ahriman, you know. And so if we just get rid of Ahriman, we can go back to heaven and everything will be great. But wait. What about creation? I mean, God made the world. I mean, if it was just going to be full of shit, why would he bother? Okay? I mean, wait a minute. You know, there's something else going on here. We'll hit this again in the book on Ibn Arabi. You know, I was a hidden treasure and I longed to be known, therefore I created the world, and there's all this cool stuff in it, and you should enjoy it. You know, have a good time. The Greek sense of beauty. Go out there, go to the symposium and do some metaphysics, and then mess around with, you know, other people. Yeah. Yeah. There is, and yeah, I mean, you know, take me with a grain of salt, but I'm going to go with this. He's referring to the twofold state of being which characterizes Mazdean ontology, and which is designated by the two terms Minok and Getik. I don't know how they're pronounced. We must take care not to reduce the contrast they express to a Platonic schema pure and simple. So Corbin is a Platonist, but he's not just any Platonist. He's a particular kind of Platonist, you know? So it's very complicated. We are not dealing with an opposition between idea and matter. God, you know, and maybe it's just me. it isn't just me. But I think it's entirely possible that none of you are as contaminated by that distinction as I still seem to be. Which is why I love Corbin and Hillman so much, because they devote their lives, their professional lives, to trying to demolish that distinction, which I still make so. The idea between the distinction between idea and matter. I am still seriously contaminated by that. And there's plenty of philosophers who would say, well, it's because it's true. No, it isn't. So he doesn't want us to do that. Pay attention to yourself as you're thinking this through. Do you do that, or do you welcome and fall easily into what he then proposes? Menoch should rather be translated by a celestial, invisible, spiritual, but perfectly concrete state. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So he does this again, for those of you who know Corbin, he does this again when he's talking about Swedenborg. That's another place where he does it. So he does it in talking about the Greeks sometimes. He does it seriously, intensely here. Other times he's not so intent upon it, and that leads us into those aspects of Corbin which do tend to make me, at least, want to float off into a better world. But here, in 1951, he's really insisting on the valorization of the material. And this reminds me, and I've got in one of the books, probably the first one, when I was originally working on Corbin, I think it was either Chittick, it was William Chittick, who emphasizes that the classical Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, is extremely, what's the word? Experiential and concrete. And I thought, well, that helps me understand some of the tension that I feel in Corbin, because from this point of view, if insofar as Chittick is right, and I have no doubt that he is, that the Arabic terms almost always have a material referent, it's really grounded in a way that English is not. And I'm functionally monolingual, so I'm only saying things that scholars have pointed out. And English, along with a handful of other modern European languages, is really abstract. We have lots of abstract nouns. And that, Corbin would be happy to say, is not surprising. And that we should do something about that. Yes. Hi, Leah.
Can I ask you something? Do you think that his this kind of refusal that he has to keep separate categories is partly the same? Here it's a material and non-material, but it's a little bit like what he does in the Mundus Imaginalis, the world in between, that it's very important for him not to have a cut of categories. He wants something like the in-between that is a mode of reality, as he would say. It's a little bit of that and it's a little bit of that. It has something from this world and something from that world. It's very much against his grain just to block something, because, and I think that's what he said. That's what we leave to the poets, he said, to play in between. Because that's really a sort of knowledge that we can have only if we don't really have strict categories with specific delimited that you put borders around it and that's it.
I think that's absolutely right, and I'm super glad that you mentioned that, because we will get to the in-betweenness. He derives that from, at least from Ibn Arabi. And this is a good point. I should have Chittick's book right next to me because I got a lot out of that. I think it's his first book on Ibn Arabi, The Self-Disclosure of God, or maybe no, that's the second book. Anyway, in one of the books, so let me back off. This, what Leah was referring to is the idea of the imaginal world, the world of the imagination, as being in between the abstract concepts on the one hand and the world of sensation on the other. And William Chittick's analysis of Ibn Arabi, in a very short space, Ibn Arabi says, well, strictly this category of the in-between is super important because from one point of view, Ibn Arabi says, everything is in between because everything is in between something and something else. And the in-between function par excellence is the imagination. And as Leah was suggesting, it's imagination that has a hard time with delimited categories. You know? I mean, because you just look at I'd be anthropomorphic. Look at a sealed box, you know, and somebody with no imagination, which is by definition impossible in Corbin's world because we all got a little bit, but it could be totally dysfunctional. If you got any kind of imagination, you got to open the box, you know, and so the imagination likes to transgress boundaries. It is liberal and liberating, and it is the bane of conservatives and fundamentalists of all stripes, and which is why Corbin's theology is heretical, and why he was so enthusiastic about heretics. And so this what's a good word? This stew of delimited categories that we're swimming in, time, space, matter, the person, is the home of the imagination. I think that's one way of saying what the point Leah was trying to make. So we'll keep seeing him doing this. But more than that, the thought of the heart is not just. If I were parroting Hillman, I would say the thought of the heart is the thought of images. That is the recital of which Corbin was a master. We talked about that paragraph last time. I think. Right now, I would say that Corbin might dispute that and say, no, it's not so much my mind is racing in 20 different ways. I'm finding it really hard to find the horse to ride. Corbin would say it's not so much the thought of images, which is hard enough to, for a modern Westerner to stick with. It's the thought of persons. And that, it seems to me that somewhere in this essay, there might exist the phrase thinking with persons. If it's in there, would someone please point it out eventually? Because that's what he's suggesting. I mean, Hillman and a poet might say, thinking with images, or Einstein. The sciences are imaginative, as is any other activity of human beings, and the greatest scientists know that. So Einstein thought with music, and he thought with images. Corbin here is pushing that even further and saying, yeah, but what you're really thinking with is persons, but you haven't quite gotten, well, what haven't you gotten? Here it's come together for me, but it's not good for you yet. Wait a minute. What does that mean? Oh my God, it means there needs to be another person in the room. At this, yeah, here's the solipsistic, introverted, shy, disfigured human being in me speaking. Because as long as you're, which is good, that's because we need him to speak. Because you see, you could write about this stuff in a book that you wrote sitting alone in a room, but you can't think with persons alone, right? So, I'm forever catching myself in the project of turning Corbin into an early feminist thinker, and he wasn't. But there are hints there, and this is one of them. I mean, by extension, that would mean that the ancient Zoroastrians were closet feminists, and that's not true. But from our point of view, the argument here is not just about the Minok and the Getic and the beauty of the material world. The material world has its substance and its beauty only because it's personified. The person is the first and final fact. I ran across, in this volume, Man and Time, which is the book that this essay was first published in English. It's a volume in the series that was published by, what's his name? Joseph Campbell. In this first volume, published in 58, I think, or 1956, Corbin wrote a preface for the whole volume, because it was lectures from the Aranos Academy, right? And the first essay was The Time of Aranos. So he wrote this, the cyclical time essay, in 51 or 52, but he wrote The Time of Aranos in 56, and it's in there that he says, and I'm only paraphrasing slightly, that in these cosmologies, the person is the first and final fact, and that, I think, and here's another example where his terminology is likely to throw you off if you had the kind of upbringing that I had, okay, which is person. The person is the first and final fact. Well, you're either going to go to your own personhood and inflate that, or you're going to go to the personhood of God, and then everything kind of falls apart, because unless you're super religious, which I was not and wasn't raised that way, that's kind of an empty category. So it leaves this hard to fill in, Well, he can't mean me, because I know he's not a solipsist. He's not a Cartesian. That would be one way to read it. The person is the first and final fact. I think, therefore I am. He's not doing that. And then God is the final person, but that doesn't give me anything. And he never taught. That's apophatic. We don't, there's just nothing to be said there. Here, on page whatever this is, about the Minok and the Getic, this is where he packs everything in, all right? The concept of this dimension of light, because we're talking about light, an archetypal dimension because it grounds I mean, my God, Henri, Jesus, no wonder. The concept of this dimension of light is an archetypal dimension because it grounds every being in another self. Because, I mean, and you know, you find this later in Proclus, in the reading later, in Marsilio Ficino. I mean, it's not, and you find it in Swedenborg. You know, even rocks have, I mean, it's not much personhood, but even rocks have personhood. So you really have to believe this. Every being, this dimension of light grounds every being. First of all, it grounds light. Light grounds every being. There's a category mistake for anybody, well, for a lot of people. You know, you go to heaven. You know, you follow the light. Think of think of Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, but she wasn't going anywhere. She was staying right there. Thank you very much. And so I think that's really kind of pertinent, okay? It grounds every being in another self which keeps eternally ahead. So you're always moving. You might, oh man, this is so cool. I'm sorry, but so Leslie Scalapino, the poet, says that if you stay to one, if you don't keep moving, you have to, you will get immobilized by your own thought or the thought that someone else has imposed upon you. So you have to be undergoing a continual conceptual rebellion. That is Corbin's idea of the perpetual hermeneutic in reading the book, the Quran, the Bible, or the world. And it's also right here, because the dimension of light grounds every being in another self which keeps eternally ahead. So you're always being dragged into the in-between. As a limited, finite person, you know that you have the sense that you don't know who you are, but you're probably, you know, kind of a definite thing. And you can only conceptualize your angel. Well, no, that's not true, but you can most easily conceptualize your angel as a kind of delimited being. And in between those two conceptually delimited beings, that angel's always dragging you into the imagination, always dragging you ahead. And of course, this is supposed to come in a few pages, but the crowning glory of the idea of the angel grounding each being in another self, which keeps eternally ahead, the culmination of that is that even the Ormazd has an angel out ahead, grounding him in another self. Okay, so okay, I'm still trying to get at, I'm still trying to get at what, and it won't work for you, but it did for me this morning. That sudden sense that, oh my God, he's flipped everything upside down, which I got this morning. Okay, oh man. You gotta. I mean, you could spend the rest of the 8 weeks on this paragraph. Fears of constant being. Okay, twofold plane. We're not reducing this to celestial and material in any kind of Platonic way, where there's this abstract form, and then there's like the chair, the form of the chair, or the form of beauty, and here is a beautiful thing. We're not doing that. He says we're definitely not doing that. That is not what this is. Menoch is a celestial invisible, spiritual, but perfectly concrete state. Getic designates an earthly, visible, material state, but of a matter which is in itself wholly luminous. A matter immaterial in relation to the matter that we actually know. Now, if you're not amenable to the argument I'm making, you would poke at that sentence and say, yeah, but what he's saying is that down here we know the really lousy earth, and therefore you should be careful about putting your hot palms on the grass because demons might come up and get you. But I don't think that's where we want to put our emphasis. For he says, and this is a peculiarly Zoroastrian idea, a transition to the state of the material, the getic, means in itself not a fall, but rather a fulfillment and a plenitude. There it is. That's that moment of creation that we'll see again in the book on Ibn Arabi, where God breathed the sigh of compassion and breathed just the myriad, gazillion, infinite number of creatures into being. It's a fulfillment and a plenitude. And it's gone from me, but it'll come back. It is not a fall, but a fulfillment and a plenitude, because this earthly, visible, material state in itself is wholly luminous. Now, redemption, the whole story, because this is a huge cosmology, it's a cosmogony, it's a battle between good and evil, and I'm suppressing all that. So there is a sense of the cosmic battle because the world that we actually have has been contaminated by Ahriman, who's the power of darkness. And so there is a grand dramaturgy here with persons all the way down fighting each other. And once the victory has come, you get to keep all the toys. There's no disembodied. You get the flowers and the green trees, and you get the minerals, you get the fully luminous matter, which was created by Ormuzd in the first instance because it was so friggin' beautiful. Look at what I can do. And all these creatures are going to love me. At least that's the story as Corbin tells it in the other book, not here. So the historically and conceptually confusing part, depending on where you started all this, is if you grew up wedded to an idea of the good God and an immaterial heaven and a fallen earth down here, this is going to mangle because it cross-references. It breaks matter into good matter and bad matter, and it turns everything upside down. And you see this. There's a I'm not sure. In one of, I think it's in his interview with Philip Nemo, but I'm not sure where it is. Somewhere, Corbin talks about a conversation that he had with, was it Tabatabai? One of the traditional Islamic Shiite scholars that he knew personally. And the question that Corbin asked him had to do with the fall, the Christian notion of the fall. And Tabatabai said, that it really wasn't a fall. I wish I could quote it. I almost can, but I can't. It wasn't really a fall. I mean, yeah, there was a what Augustine called a felix culpa, the happy sin, because I mean, whatever it was that Adam and Eve did, in certain versions of the story, it caused the collapse of heaven into all this shit down here. But Tabatabai said, no, it's really wrong to think of this as a fall, because without that moment of creation, none of this stuff would be here. and I mean, it's not striking me now as it did this morning, but it just turns the story of fall and redemption on its head. But then, in all honesty and fairness, there is still a story of redemption and a story of overcoming of evil and all that. And there's still, even with Swedenborg, there's a return to heaven. But in Swedenborg, the angels are pretty sexy. The angels engage in, all the pleasures of earthly life. They just have it better. And Corbin seems very happy with that. And this is the Corbin who finds that to be really delightful. You fuse the Greek ideal of beauty with some weird Abrahamic vision of heaven. And if that doesn't seem right to you, then you drag along the Zoroastrian idea that the material world was created to be beautiful and wonderful and glorious, and it was Ahriman who screwed it up. So there's nothing whatsoever bad about the creation. It's a fulfillment and a plenitude. I mean, I think that really, really struck me this morning. As many times as I've been through this stuff, it really struck me when I read that. A transition to the state of Getic means in itself not a fall, but rather a fulfillment and a plenitude. And I thought, oh, well, you knucklehead, of course. He says that a million times, says it all sorts of places. But to put it here, and as I was reading it, it was in stark contrast to the story of the fall. And that's when I connected to the evolutionary story of the Big Bang. Okay? Because the creation myth, which modern physical sciences give us, says, well, it started with, everything. And then it blew up, and within, some gazillionth of a second, we had all the particles. And then you hang around for whatever it is, 15 billion years or something. And it's a story of fulfillment and plenitude. Although, scientists don't say that. But you get all this cool stuff, like people, and whatever else lives in the other galaxies. And I suddenly thought, oh, well, that's better than fall and redemption, and I'm not articulating this well at all. But it's a glorious theology. It's a glorious theology which has God creating things because they are loving and beautiful, and we should participate in it. And redemption, which he talks about a lot, and here I'll bring two other things close together in Corbin's work, and yes, I know we're out of time, which is also fine. Redemption will bring the flowering of the body to come, the resurrection body. it does not tend to destroy, that is resurrection and redemption, does not tend to destroy the material world, but to restore it to its luminous state, its archetypal dimension. That's not the Christianity that I learned. And I didn't learn any, but I strongly suspect it's very close to the Christianity of maybe Ivan Illich, but that's a separate issue. Let's just finish with this up. This dimension of light constitutes every being as the counterpart. I don't want to. Now it's going to take us. This dimension of light constitutes every being as the counterpart of a celestial reality with which it forms a pair. And this runs all through Corbin. It's really quite astonishing how everything is in here. Its archetype or angel. It is, let me just read this. It is by establishing this dimension that the Zoroastrian metaphysical imagination attests its characteristic aptitude for configuring hypostases, for making the features of a celestial person shine through all reality. This representative norm is so fundamental that time itself will be apprehended as a person with definite traits. Okay. Yeah. Is there anything else? Well, we'll do the pictures next time. Wait a minute. Yeah. So the super important thing he said in all that was the recognition. Yeah, let's translate this last feature from scholarly Zoroastrian mythology into contemporary gender-conscious philosophical terms. So the Mazdians' metaphysical imagination, he says, has had a characteristic aptitude for configuring hypostases, for making the features of a celestial person shine through all reality. Well, you got to back that down a little bit. But in contemporary terms, well, this is backing it way down. You can't think alone. No, see, I did it again. You can't be alone. It is not possible to do hima alone. It is not possible to be a human being in the world without recognizing the influences of other persons. So it's the absolute opposite of Descartes. It's the total, So not only does it turn the creation myth upside down, but it also totally inverts Descartes. I think, therefore, there must be somebody else in this room. There must be.
But if everything is a person, Tom, if everything is a person,
yeah, I know.
If there is a chair in the room, I have another person.
Yeah, no, I want to say that.
If there is a flower in the room, there is another person. So it doesn't really mean anything. I'm never.
No,
all the time with person.
Okay, yes, no, I know, all right, and yes, I'm pushing this, I'm pushing it because I'm trying to see what it would feel, taste, and smell like, and yes, there is. So if everything, I mean, this is a problem. Ibn Arabi knew about it. If everything's imagination, then nothing's imagination, and he's very sophisticated in handling that. And so if everything's a person, then nothing is a person. Oh, that's not true. So we would. Oh man. So I don't know where I'm getting this, but somebody, in discussing Van Gogh, points out that many people know that there's a small painting by Van Gogh of a chair. It's an old chair in somebody's house in the country. Or Heidegger does the same thing with the shoes. There are persons. Those are paintings of partial, not whole persons, but the chair has personality. Any painting, well, maybe not any painting, but many, most, all works of art have personhood. Not all, but and so the question that's making Leah crazy, and in my better moments makes me crazy, is what sort of content can I possibly give to this? And my only defense is that so far it's being more useful for me to be in the in-between than not. So somebody not me needs to would be required to flesh out in what ways it is possible to be how are partial personalities manifested. And you could go to Jung, because he's full of partial personalities and little fragments of complexes, and Hillman with the gods. And every time I start moving around in that kind of way of thinking, I mean, I see eyes in trees all the time, and I think I mean that in a serious way. Or in order to come to terms with the Leia's, use that example. If there's no one in the room but me, and yet I'm going to argue that the room is full of persons, how am I going to get at their personhood? And one way to do it would be to write a poem about the chair, And it would be, the argument here somehow is that it would be impossible. I'm sorry. So push that argument this way. Any physicist will say, I don't use personhood when I'm calculating a projectile's trajectory. Absolutely not. And then you would ask him to describe the projectile's movement. And either this person would draw the mathematics on the board. I can't flesh this out without being super boring and everybody's tired. But here's a homework. Try to think of some human activity that you can definitively say has no trace of personhood in it. And my argument would be it would have to be something that could not have a poem written about it. because you see, the argument tends to be, and I worry about this, Leah, the argument tends to become so totalizing that then you can't get out of it. And being a person of the in-between, I kind of worry about that. But I'm very happy, at least in the waning decades of my life, to try to live out the imaginative cosmology which posits that there are persons everywhere, and it makes life more interesting. That's and for me, that's the only, well, no, but it's and makes I've lost it. I'm so convinced of this. No, I'm so convinced of the utility. I'm so convinced of the power of whatever we've been talking about here to bring people back to something like a state of joy, that I'm not going to let go of it, in spite of the fact that the philosophical mind inside me really rebels at saying that persons are everywhere and that the imagination is everything, because you learn that in philosophy 101. If everything is something, then show me something that isn't, and I can't tell what it is. So anyway, you see the point. This stuff, this is great, and we didn't get to anything except a bit. Yeah.
Quick question: is the fulfillment and plentitude the same as the pleroma?
Yes. Yeah, I think he uses. Well, let's put it this way. When he's using the term pleroma, it's often in a context of. Gosh, I got to say, bringing the world to life, in the sense in which he does when he references Proclus in the book on Ibn Arabi, the heliotrope. I said this a million times. So Proclus says that the heliotrope is a flower that follows the sun, and it's praying to its Lord in the capacity of which it's possible for a plant to pray. That kind of, when Corbin uses the term plenitude, it's often when he's talking about, I actually don't know this to be true. It's often when he's really enthusiastic about something like angelic hierarchies. But I think that when he does that, if we still have remnants of a depauperate heaven in our psyches from being poorly taught as a child, that we do much better at understanding what he means by the plenitude of angelic hierarchies if we focus on this passage in his story of the Zoroastrians. I don't think he ever lets go of that. And in his very last writings, he's still talking about the Zoroastrians and the idea of light. And so we'll talk about, where are we reading next time? I think there's no way we can possibly get out of this book, but we will. I think, how are we going to make a segue to that? What did I do?
Avicenna.
Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, it all, I honestly, it all fits together. So I haven't told you which parts of Avicenna, so I'll pick some short things. Gosh.
Tom?
Yeah.
Could I ask a question? Because you brought in some concepts of Taoism and then the 10,000 things, and you liken that to the pleroma, as in the Tao was 10,000 things manifest within the tissue of that.
Yeah.
So I'm visualizing sort of like the pleroma as sort of like a semi-permeable membrane with everything contained in it. And you spoke about Ormazad having the angel out ahead, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
that was pulling
Yeah.
it forward as well.
Yeah.
Now, is Ahriman contained in the form
Oh.
beyond that within the void? And is the angel out of head in relation to Ormazad extant beyond the pleroma?
Okay, so I don't even know how to answer that. So you will have noticed, if you've done things with me, I'd stay away from the question of evil because it makes life so complicated. It makes things so complicated. Which of course it does. And everybody knows that. And maybe that's why religions are so complicated, because once you get down into the details, it's like, oh shit, should I kill this bug or not?
Perhaps I'll type that out in an email to you and send it in an email.
Yeah. So there are two. Corbin. So what does Corbin think? Boy, what does Corbin think? He, until his dying days, remember he lived through World War I and World War II. I mean, he was elsewhere in World War II, but he was alive for it. To his deathbed, he believed in the positive power of evil and that it was a battle to be fought. I think that he, there's a lot, right to the end, there's a lot of Zoroastrianism, filtered as may be through Islam, and I can't judge that. But there's a lot of that dualist flavor in Corbin. And if you'd lived through the Second World War, you might feel the same way. It's easy now to feel the same way. And I think that is traceable, that line of but in this essay, he distinguishes two forms of Zervanism or Mazdian Zervanism, and in one, the evil is outside of Ormazd entirely. And this is worth, I've got to stick around for another minute. You're all dismissed and go have your dinners, but there's another super cool thing in here which has always knocked me out. And I won't even try to look for it because I like making up my own version. Notice that in the version of the myth in which the evil principle is engendered within the supreme being, Ormazd, notice what causes it. It's like doubt. All right? So, and I was reading this again and realized that I tell a bastardized story of it, but that's fine because I think it gets the idea. So God's sitting around, and he wants to do something. There's not much going on. So he decides to make a world, be a creator and be all powerful. And then he thinks, what if I'm not all powerful? What if this doesn't work? It's a little moment of doubt. Boosh! That creates Ahriman. That creates evil. And in another version of the story, it's this. Well, that's not the one we want to tell here. That's not the one we want to tell here. But it's doubt, and this pops up again. And so this is this theme of the catastrophic, the cosmologically catastrophic nature of doubt pops up again in the story of Ibn Arabi circumambulating the Kaaba and being spoken to by his angel in the form of that young woman whose name escapes me at the moment, because it's a theme which, now it's actually too personal. Not that I wouldn't do it, but it takes too long to get the personal stuff out there. The most important moment I ever had reading Corbin was in reading that story of the circumambulation around the Kaaba, and Ibn Arabi has this doubt. He wonders whether the divine beings are still there, whether they've disappeared. And it's a moment of existential doubt, mirrored here by the moment of Ormuzd's own existential doubt. And in this case, it gives rise to the principle of evil. In the case of the story that is told around the Kaaba, Ibn Arabi's female Sophia, angel, says to him in a similar, there's an essay here somewhere, in a similar moment which amounts to deflating an inflated ego, she says, the divine figures are fine, man. You're the one with the problem. Don't blow this. I mean, who do you think you are anyway? She would have said the same thing to Nietzsche when he said, God is dead. And she would have said, man, who do you think you are? I mean, isn't that a little much? And this is like an inverse of the moment here. At any rate, the theme of doubt shows up a few times in Corbin, and I think that each of those times is kind of an image of the other, which is worth thinking about. Oh my God. Anyway, I found this really interesting to read this time, and I'm glad you all did too, and we'll segue somehow into the Avicenna stuff. We want to talk about Tahwil and hermeneutics, because we're at week 2, so we have to talk about hermeneutics in week 3. But that will tie in with this whole light discussion, and it will all make sense, he said. Thank you for coming, and and thank you for putting up with it, really. So I'll see you all next time, and sometime tonight I'll put some pages up. Otherwise, read the whole book. Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Bye. Bye all.